Okay, this is part 2 of the 3rd session, still going. These are sources as far as who the New Testament says was guilty. The New Testament as a whole can't just be broken into, the one synoptic gospel that I might like. You have to take all of those books together, and the New Testament as a whole comes to the conclusion that it's the leaders of the Jews, and then the population of Jerusalem in the form of the mob that calls for his execution according to their story. And then third, Pilate and Herod, the Roman authorities who seem to be kowtowing to groups number 1 and 2. So the New Testament sources try and place the blame on the Sanhedrin, the Pharisees, and the people of Jerusalem. Historically, as a matter of fact, the execution was, of course, done by Pontius Pilate. And even their books are clear that the execution was done by Pontius Pilate. So, him blaming somebody else, again, seems a little out of character, but historically false. So from our point of view, he was executed by the Romans after a bizarre series of trials that do not convict him under Jewish law, but they are quite upset at the one claim, which is the claim of Messiah and Son of God. And the Pharisees in that trial do respond to him. They say, are you this? Have you claimed this? People say you have claimed this. And for the most part, he says, it is you who say I am.
He never says it himself.
There's one quote where he says I am in one of the books. But in most of the cases where he's challenged on that, he says, it is you who say I am. And then they respond, that's all we need to hear. In other words, you should say no. Right? Are you the Messiah and the Son of God? That's a yes-no question, not an I am rubber, you are glue, what you say bounces off of me and sticks to you. Which is basically what he says. It is you who say I am. So that doesn't really, that you should say no if the answer is no. We had the same thing, by the way, with completely different scenarios, so don't get upset, everybody, but with the Lubavitcher Rabbi, where there were followers saying he was Messiah before he died, and he surely must have been aware of that, and he never said no, which gives fuel to that schism within the Chabad movement. Was he Messiah? Was he not Messiah? And now there's people trying to redefine what Messiah should be so that he could have been. And, it's the same kind of a social dynamic that goes on when you know something's going on and you don't say no. It empowers people to continue to say it. Okay, so that's enough of that. I want to get back to our topic, which is Judaism in the New Testament. Let's look at holidays. Remember, we're talking about background. The whole point of the Judaism here is twofold. One, it's to make the rabbis and the Sanhedrin bad guys and to blame them for the crucifixion of Jesus by rejecting his message. Okay? That's goal number 1 in the New Testament. So you can't really say that the books by themselves have an agenda of creating a Judeo-Christian harmony. A Jew reading these books does not see any effort at Judeo-Christian harmony. We have to understand, however, that the Judaism of today is not the Judaism of Jerusalem at that time. And just because their guy 2,000 years ago fought with our guys 2,000 years ago doesn't mean a lot of water hasn't gone under the bridge and we can't find harmony and cooperation and mutual understanding today. We can. Purpose of this class, however, is to ignore those 2,000 years, bad and good, and go back into the texts themselves and see how Judaism is portrayed. So Judaism is portrayed, number 1, as legalistic, hypocritical, and politically manipulating Pharisees and Sanhedrin as a backdrop over and against Jesus teaching an enlightened message that they are annoyed by. Okay? And the authority of Jesus to teach that message seems to be internal to himself. There's no claim of higher authority as he does it. Okay? So that's background number 1. Pause before the new topic starts. I saw a hand up and a hand up.
It says on the sheet, the 6 trials.
Yes.
The third religious trial, Sanhedrin, you said he was dead, but you said it was not.
This is a source that says what the indication would be if they had ruled. They're not ruling that he should be killed, but the ruling, what the end of the story is. So, for example, the Sanhedrin trial in question there is, they say, "Are you Messiah, Son of God?" And he says, "It's you who say I am." And they say, "Who needs to hear more than that?" Okay? So the conclusion is, certainly the text is portraying them as convinced that he has committed the crime in question, and we know that crime to be a death penalty offense of heresy against the name of God. So it doesn't then say, "and they convicted him to death." But the outcome of that trial, if we're being intellectually objective, would be, if he doesn't get ping-ponged off to somebody else, that's a death penalty offense. And they seem pretty convinced of it. Right? So it's not like it ties it up in a bow and the gavel comes down and we can read the verdict, because that didn't happen. Instead, he gets sent back to Pilate. Right?
Where is Judas?
We don't need to worry about Judas. Judas is one of the 12 disciples following Jesus. He was the one who sold Jesus' location over to the Romans the night before all the trials took place so that he could get arrested, and then all the trials are happening. But Judas is gone. He's not part of this story, and he's certainly not part of the Jewishness of the story on any level.
The Christian Bible, does that include Matthew and Luke?
Yes, the Christian Bible starts with the 3 synoptic, and then John, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and then Acts of the Apostles, and then a number of letters, and then some books like Revelations, which are beyond my ability to really get into and explain at this point. So their main thrust of their Bible is the story of Jesus, and then people in the first couple generations preaching about the message of Jesus. Yes?
Yeah, in the book that I'm reading now, it's Jesus, the historian review of the Gospels.
Okay.
So I reviewed it, of course, during the week. In replying to asking the question whether Jesus was the Messiah or the Son of God, according to this book, he said he did not answer the question.
Right. He does answer the question. The answer is, the book is wrong if it says that. He does answer the question. His answer is, "It is you who say I am." That's his answer.
Because if they blame it on the Jews, and I've heard Christians say over and over again, "We killed Jesus." You hear that over and over again.
Well, that's because their Bible says we did.
That's right, and that's exactly correct. But that's what they're learning.
Okay, so let's
In this book,
Let's time out on that. The Christian Bible says the Jews in Jerusalem called for his execution, and Pontius Pilate acquiesced and allowed the execution to happen. That's the Christian Bible. There are a lot of ways to deconstruct that story, and there's no reason that story should have any impact on Jews later on, unless you're going to take an anti-Semitic approach.
well, that's what exactly is happening. That the New Testament does blame it on the Jews. For all these centuries, they have taught that in schools.
Okay, I'm not going to... Thank you, Bernice. You're distracting from where I'm trying to go.
I'm getting information.
It's distracting information, Bernice.
In this book, it states that there are many historians that give their interpretation. Many historians give either the same interpretation or different. We Jews have been scapegoats for many centuries.
Okay.
Because we have never spoken up.
Bernice, I love you. I love you. I admire your reading and your knowledge. I really do love you. It's a little frustrating if we go too far down that road, because it's not a class in historical anti-Semitism. And so it's a class in Judaism in the New Testament. Okay, so the book is, what's the name of the book? And I'll recommend it for people to read. What's the book?
Jesus and Historian Review of the Gospels.
Jesus and Historian's Review of the Gospels by
Michael Grant.
Michael Grant. I haven't read the book, but it's recommended by Bernice in the class. I would recommend, if you're looking for historical Jesus stuff, Schweitzer wrote a good book called The Quest for the Historical Jesus, which summarizes a large movement in Christianity in the 19th century to uncover archaeologically and literarily the history of Jesus as a human figure. And it's important, and I would recommend that you read that. The answer to the question is unclear. In the Gospels, which are slanted against the Jews of the time, it is clear that the question is posed under threat to Jesus, are you Messiah and Son of God? And that he evades the question by saying, it is you who say I am. Okay, so that's ambiguous. And what can you do with that? Is a court going to convict on that or not convict on that?
In a sense, couldn't you say then he did not answer because he actually did evade the question?
He evades the question, but he doesn't deny. Are you innocent until proven guilty? That is a modern sense. Are you guilty until proven innocent? That is much more classical thinking. And he didn't prove his innocence. So what are you doing? So do you have witnesses that he claimed? This is probably what the witnesses couldn't do. You don't have two witnesses who are going to come and say, I heard him say I'm Messiah and Son of God. Because every time someone asked him, he winked. Right? Are you the Messiah and Son of God? It's not an answer. So you don't have witnesses who hear him say it who can convict him in front of the Sanhedrin. That's probably the legal basis of all this. By the way, last week you told me there's 3 synoptics, and I said 4. You're right, it's 3 synoptics, and the 4th John is canonical, but the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, are the ones that line up, and they tell the same stories in the same order, which is why they're called synoptics. So, nice correction. Go ahead.
So beyond the trial, there's, and I'm going back decades, and so I can't quote, there's a lot of scurrilous material, particularly by Paul, against the Jews in the Christian Bible.
Yes, once we get to the Acts of the Apostles, we're no longer as much in the land of Israel, in the Jewish milieu and anymore. And the conclusion is that they rejected the Christ, and they called for his death, and it's a sinful generation, and all those kinds of things come in. And if you want to deconstruct that in a favorable way, you would say, that's where he happened to be. If it had been in the middle of Germany and people had strung him up, we would be saying the Germans. It's not because Jews are inherently bad. We're just identifying the people who rejected him. The truth of the matter is that if that person came and sat in this room and said the things that he is quoted as saying in the New Testament, I would reject him too. It contradicts the Torah. That's my text. That's my religion. That's my people. And I think it's smart and it's sacred and it's holy and it's been around a really long time, and I don't see the authority there. You have to say, well, he's Messiah and Son of God. Okay. If you're Messiah and Son of God, you get to do that. If you're not Messiah and Son of God, you don't get to do that. So that's really the point. So the people who have the conversation usually are already in one camp or the other, and they're going to hear for the answers that will validate where they are, one camp or the other. And so it's not really something that's going to be resolved by anybody who's within a faith community. Yeah.
Can you identify these sources, Annas and Caiaphas? What are those?
Annas and Caiaphas are, okay, in the trials of Jesus, Caiaphas is the high priest at the time, and he has a strange role in the Christian Bible where he is the head of the trial. And the high priest would not have been the head of the Sanhedrin or the head of a tribunal in the way that he's presented in this. And Annas is his the immediately prior high priest, who in one of the versions Caiaphas goes to get his opinion, should this guy be convicted or not of this offense. So these are 2 high priests that are being presented.
So they wrote letters or notes of the trial?
They're in the plot. They're in the prose. We don't have a document from them. They're characters in the other Gospels.
Oh, so all of this is from the Gospel?
This is all from the Gospels.
Okay.
Yeah.
Why would the Sanhedrin punt to the Romans?
Okay, so why would the Sanhedrin punt to the Romans? It's interesting. Let me just back up and give a little historical doubt throwing here. The whole trial of Jesus is a crafted telling. Because it's happening with Herod and Pilate and the Sanhedrin and everything else, it's not out in public. So everything from the Sermon on the Mount and all those other things are happening in public, and the Synoptic Gospels all describe what it is. And I think on some level you've got people reflecting what their experiences were. It's happening in public. The whole trial of Jesus is a literary construction And I'm not sure how we know what's going on in those closed doors. So that's something just to kind of preface it. Now repeat your question.
After his trial by the Sanhedrin.
Why would Herod punt back to Pilate? Again, the Jewish courts at the time were reticent to execute anybody. And so it doesn't seem to me that even with this grave offense, the testimony that I see in the New Testament would not have been sufficient to convict him, because he doesn't acknowledge it and they don't have witnesses. So they wouldn't have had the ability to convict him of it. So if Pilate sent him to Herod, which is what happened, he's arrested by the Romans. He's not arrested by the Jews. He's arrested by the Romans, and the Romans can't convict him, so he's a troublemaker among the Jews. They send him to the religious courts, right? Are you fomenting civil rebellion against Rome? No. Oh, you're a religious nut job. Send him to the Sanhedrin. That's their job. We authorize Herod and the Sanhedrin to be in charge of Jewish religion. Take care of business, gentlemen. So the Romans send him down. They go to take care of business, and they can't convict him of anything. But he was handed to them in chains from the Romans. They probably couldn't just set him free since Rome had arrested him. So they give Rome the prisoner back. Right? So I think he goes back to Pilate because it's Pilate's prisoner. Right? Pilate tried to get them to take care of it for him because he had been gathering crowds in the city, right? And that's dangerous at pilgrimage time. So the Jews, actually, despite how angry and upset a lot of people are with him, they seem to hand him back to the Romans, not necessarily for execution, but because he's their prisoner. Right? And what else are they going to do?
While they were...
Hang on just a second.
While they were a religious court, they were also tasked with keeping peace.
Yes.
And if they see, here's this leader that seems to be fomenting some sort of problems, they've got to make sure that that's tamped down, however they do it.
Well, the question is, what would they have done? If the Sanhedrin convicted him of a crime, what would they have done?
Put him in prison?
There's no such thing as prison. You excommunicate him, you fine him, you flog him, or you execute him. Those are your options.
Don't they expel him?
They do none of them.
Put him in Chayrim.
They could put him in Chayrim. They don't do it. The New Testament doesn't know about Chayrim, doesn't know about flogging. He would have been flogged. Probably publicly flogged would have been the logical outcome had this been a genuine Jewish court. But it's not a Jewish court. It's more like an investigation of this Roman prisoner, right? That's why the pinging back and forth. You have jurisdiction issues here, right? Over here I had a question. And Bernice, go ahead.
From what I've read, and I've studied this situation for many years, not just a week, many years. One of the things that the Pharisees had against Jesus was the fact that at that time, the Pharisees believed that God was in heaven. Jesus came up with the idea, the concept, that God is everywhere. So that really troubled the Pharisees. They brought that issue to the Romans, that the kingdom of God is everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
The Romans misunderstood that concept and thought that, Jesus was going to take over the Roman Empire. That's the one thing
Okay.
against Jesus.
So,
Nothing else.
to summarize Bernice's comment here, it's that the trouble Jesus got into was because theologically he didn't believe in a God in heaven. He believed in a God who was immanent everywhere. And Bernice says the Pharisees wouldn't have liked that. I don't agree. I think the Pharisees had a sense of God everywhere, but I'm with you. He used the language of kingdom of heaven, which is a new concept that would have been theologically troubling to the Pharisees because we're not sure what that is. That's a novelty on his part. And because it has the word kingdom in it, it would have made Rome very uncomfortable. And so his arrest and trial by Rome is very much because he's gathering crowds underneath the banner of a new kingdom. And that would have been a political problem. Okay, let's look at the holidays because time is escaping. Which holidays does the New Testament know about? This is a whole new topic. Which holidays does it know about? Which holidays do they observe? Okay, let's take them in order. Passover, for sure. 14th day of the first month, the Lord's Passover, according to Leviticus, you know it well. In Matthew, in this one quote, and the disciples did as Jesus had appointed them, they made ready for Passover. What does it mean to make ready for Passover? Oi. Now, these guys are traveling, they're not at home in their kitchens, so I think it probably means selling their leaven, getting their matzah, arranging to have a sacrifice to bring up to the Temple Mount for the Korban Pesach. That's probably what it meant. They could have done it in an afternoon. Mark says, and his disciples went forth, came into the city, and found as he had said to them, and they made ready for the Passover. So there's agreement across these. Luke says his parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of Passover, and when he was 12 years old, they went up to Jerusalem after the custom of the feast. One of the few places where we've got a biographical thing from when he was young. Why 12? Because in Rabbinic Judaism at this time, that would have been the age of majority. He's able to walk there on his own. He's maybe become physically mature, and he's obligated to make the pilgrimage for the first time. So he comes from a family that at least is observant of the pilgrimage of the Pesach. They're from Beit Lechem or Nazareth, either way. They're in the area, they're in a walkable distance to Jerusalem. They're not that far away. Now, Luke has a whole story as far as the Feast of Unleavened Bread drew near. Which is interesting because the first two were calling it Pesach, and this calls it Chag HaMatzot. We know that those two different terms are used in the Torah. Chag HaMatzot refers to the week, and Passover refers to the sacrifice. Right? Okay? The first day, going into the first day. And so then they've got the chiefs and scribes sought how they might kill him, for they feared the people. And then they've got this Satan guy who goes into Judas, who is named Iscariot, being number of the 12, and he went on his way. And the whole plotting thing goes on. And Peter and John say, go and prepare us a Passover that we may eat. That means the sacrificial meat. And they say, where will you that we prepare? And he said to them, behold, when you are entered into the city, there shall be a man meet you bearing a pitcher of water. Follow him into the house where he enters, and there you will say to the manager of the house, the master said, there's a guest room, where shall I eat Passover with my disciples? He's just arranging a room. Right? So they've got the meat, they've got the room, the hour has come, they come with him, and he says in verse 16, I will not eat any more of it until it is fulfilled in the kingdom of God. And then he takes a cup and he gives thanks and he says, take this and drink it among you, for I say, I will not drink of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of the God shall come. And he took bread and he gave it and he broke it and he gave to them, saying, this is my body given to you. Do this in remembrance of me. And likewise also the cup after the supper. This is the cup of the New Testament in my blood, which is shed for you. This is the essential ritual in classical Christianity. They reenact this ritual in church on Sunday morning every time. Certainly the Episcopalians, the Catholics, and so forth, the blood is either symbolic of or transubstantiated to become the blood of Christ, and the bread is the body. This is a completely, you think your Seder is creative, this is a completely creative interpretation of what's happening here. Is this a Passover Seder? This is not a Passover Seder. This is a non-Seder happening on Passover. Okay, there's no maror, there's no bitter herbs, the matzahs here is being called bread. I assume it was matzah because they've prepared for the holiday properly. But there's no telling, there's no mention of coming out of Egypt. Remember, we don't have Exodus in the New Testament. They're not invested in that story about Jewish peoplehood. So he's taking it entirely upon himself. And then he says, I won't eat the Pesach, which is the opposite of the rabbinic command. You have to eat all of it. You can have no leftovers after midnight. You have to eat the whole darn animal. Right? You have to eat it. And so he says, I won't eat it. You have to drink 4 cups of wine. I won't drink the wine. Right? And then he breaks the matzah and so there are people who try and make a Passover Seder out of the final meal of Jesus and so forth, and they use maror, and they use the matzah, and they use all this kind of stuff. Okay.
But was there...
It's not in this piece of the story.
Were there Sidurim at that time?
The Seder is invented by the rabbis of this time. When you talk about Rabbi Gamliel and the school of Hillel and Shammai, Hillel would eat the Hillel sandwich with the Korban Pesach and the maror inside the matzah.
But that was the Mishnah, wasn't it? about 200.
The Mishnah's 200, but Hillel and Shammai aren't in the year 200. They're now.
Okay.
Remember, he's been arguing with Hillel and Shammai all along. I see he's doing it again.
Got it.
Okay? The Hillel sandwich was all the rage in Jerusalem at this time because you could eat the maror without going crazy. Right? And you fulfill a Torah verse, al matzot u'morarim tochluhu. You should eat the meat with matzah and maror. And so the rabbinic thing is now we're going to fulfill that commandment. He's not being a rabbinic Jew. He's actually refusing the Pesach until the kingdom of heaven. He's refusing the wine until the kingdom of heaven. Okay?
When he says kingdom of God, that means that he believes he's the Messiah.
You're saying that. It is you who says that, he would tell you.
You're fired.
Okay. He has, in the Gospel of John, here 2:13-23, we're not going to go through it, but you have Judaism represented here probably accurately at the base of the Temple Mount down by Robinson's Arch. If you go along those flagstones and all those stores and openings down there, it would have been an active place for people who lived too far away from Jerusalem to carry the darn goat, would have brought money and purchased a goat and then just walked up the steps for the sacrifice, much easier. Or the people who needed to exchange money for the right amount of money or the right shekels for the Beit HaMikdash or whatever it was, there would have been money changers and there would have been salesmen and there would have been shops. At the foot of the Temple Mount, it would have been a place of commerce. And there's a story here where he goes in and he finds that place of commerce and then he, gets upset with them. And then it mentions Passover specifically. John 13, when it starts to talk about his passion. Again, this is the story of the Last Supper. You can read it if you wish. And then Corinthians, which is a later book of their Bible. Somebody reciting backwards, remembering Jesus, says, now calling him Lord instead of Rabbi, because it's a later book looking back. The Lord Jesus, the same night in which they betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it, and he said, take, eat, this is my body, broke it, and so on and so forth. So in other words, the transformation away from a Passover Seder is complete in the book of Corinthians, and the Eucharist, or the taking of the host, the bread, and the blood, the wine, as a ritual is being established here in the book of Corinthians, with Passover now only as a backdrop. Now, why is Passover the backdrop for this? How does that help the Jesus story? Okay, so you have the Paschal Lamb, which is a sacrifice that is being given. What's the purpose of the Paschal Lamb, the Passover sacrifice, biblically? Is it a sin offering? No. It is not a sin offering. It is not an offering that is done for the forgiveness of sin. We have those. They're called Korban Chatat. This is the Korban Pesach. What is its purpose?
Well, to use the blood to unlock the doorway.
The original purpose was to save our people in Egypt from the Malach HaMavet, from the angel of death in the 10th plague, and that is the continuing purpose biblically moving forward. It is Pasach Alehem. It is God is hovering protectingly over them. The Pesach sacrifice is a sacrifice of protection. That's its purpose. To protect us, and because it's connected to the Omer leading to the holiday of first fruits, to protect us and the land for a harvest so that we should live and not die, which is why the rain prayers are also done beginning at that time. So this is a holiday sacrifice that the one God should protect us, the people, and the land. That's the purpose of the Passover sacrifice. Yes?
Can I ask a political question?
Yep.
Anyway, we have all these stories about the temple and the Passover and all that, and the Palestinian leaders.
No. You asked about Temple Mountain Palestinian leaders. I have 10 minutes. We're not going there. Talk to...
No, I want to talk about the Pope.
No, or the Pope. We can't talk about the Pope. Okay. Please, Morris, talk to me another time.
Okay.
I love you too, but you're killing me. Okay. Feast of Unleavened Bread, not Passover, is mentioned as well in Matthew. The Feast of Unleavened Bread. Will you prepare us? And we should prepare. We should prepare to eat the Passover. And then in Luke, he went up with the family, and he's got the whole thing there again. Okay. The Feast of Pentecost in the Christian view, which is the counting of the weeks. Pentecost means counting to 50. What holiday are we talking about?
Shavuos.
Which?
Shavuos.
Yes, I heard a Sukkot in there somewhere. Shavuot, 7 weeks of Omer, counting to the 50th day, the holiday of Shavuot and first fruits. And so you have in Leviticus, you shall count from the morrow of the Sabbath and so forth. And then in the book of Acts, chapter 2, it says, and when the day of Pentecost was fully come, they were all with one accord in one place. And suddenly there came a sound from heaven of a rushing mighty wind, and it filled all the house where they were sitting, and there appeared to them cloven tongues like as of fire, and it sat on each of them, and they were all filled with the Holy Ghost and began to speak in other tongues, as the Spirit gave them utterance. And there were dwelling at Jerusalem Jews, devout men of every nation under heaven, and the noise was abroad, and the multitude came together and was confounded, and everyone was understanding each other in all their different languages. And are these not the Galileans? And how we heard every man in their own tongue, Parthians, Medes, Elamites, Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus, Asia, Phrygia, the whole known world begins to speak in tongues and understand each other. And others are mocking, saying these men are full of new wine, which is a cultural, you're all drunk, you're drunk, you silly old fool, but also that they're drinking new wine as opposed to the old, and they're not supposed to have done that until this holiday. So this is the holiday of first fruits. And then there's a story of Peter and proclaiming, and the prophet of Joel is quoted. And then that he says, I will pour out in these days my spirit, and they shall prophesy, and I will show wonders in heaven above, signs in the earth beneath, blood and fire, vapor of smoke. The sun shall be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the great and notable day of the Lord has come. What is that quote? The great and the notable day of the Lord? That's the prophet. Nope, good guess. Micah on Shabbat Hagadol. The great and awesome day of the Lord shall come. What's that? Hine ba Yom Hashem. Exactly. All right, so he's using the prophetic background. The author of Acts is using the prophets Joel, alluding to Micah, using images of Joshua stopping the sun in heaven, and people speaking in tongues in the background of the religion of new wine at the feast of first fruits for the proclamation of whatever it is they're proclaiming to call on the name of God. So they're using the Feast of First Fruits as the backdrop for that. Not exactly a close connection, except it places it on the Jewish calendar. They're aware of that. The Feast of Trumpets, Leviticus says, we call it Rosh Hashanah. Matthew 24, there will be a sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven in power and great glory. He shall send his angels with a great sound of trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the four winds and from one end of heaven to the other. What does that sound like? Does that sound like Rosh Hashanah? No. Or Yom Kippur? Why Yom Kippur?
Because of the shofar.
Okay, so there's a shofar and they're proclaiming something momentous. But there's an image here. The four winds and the angels in the heaven and the... It sound like anything? Sounds to me like Ezekiel. It's Ezekiel's Merkavah, which we read on Shavuot.
Shavuos, right.
Again. So Shavuot is being tied in here, how the rabbis read Shavuot as a time of redemption and revelation, because for the rabbis it's the time of the giving of Torah, and the giving of Torah came with the shofar blast louder and louder. Jesus in this text is co-opting that prophetic image and energy because he becomes that which is the vehicle of salvation for them, whereas for us the vehicle of salvation, Pirkei Avot, very clearly is the Torah. Your Torah learning is what gains you the kingdom of heaven. Okay? All right. Thessalonians, one of the letters that comes later, the Lord himself shall descend from heaven with a shout, the voice of the angel, the trumpet of God, and the dead shall rise first. Who knows what the other Haftarah is for Shavuot?
I read it.
The dry bones.
Right.
The resurrection of the dry bones in the valley of death that get flesh and sinew upon them again. Symbolic of the risen nation in a time of destruction and exile, taken over in the Christian mode, the risen Christ for salvation. So these texts are clearly using the rabbinic approach to Shavuot for their imagery in the messianic figure of Jesus. All right? It's subtle, but clear as a bell. The seventh angel sounded in Revelations, and there were great voices of heaven. The kingdom of this world have become the kingdoms of our Lord and Christ, Yeshua, and forever and ever. Not sure why that one got lumped in here. Okay, Day of Atonement in Acts. Now, when much time was spent and when sailing was now dangerous because the fast was now already past, Paul admonished them. We think that's the fast of Yom Kippur being referenced, but it doesn't get a lot. So Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur really don't exist. Why?
Because they don't believe in getting the Torah.
The proclamation of God as king for them is the birth story at Christmas. And the forgiveness of sins on Yom Kippur for them is the crucifixion at Passover. Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur need to be eliminated. They're irrelevant to the New Testament story, so they don't exist in any of the stories. The basic theology of Rabbinic Judaism that addresses those things, kingship of God and forgiveness of the people, is Christianity's unique message. They can't do it through our mode, because they're doing it through the biography and execution of Jesus. Feast of Tabernacles was the great day. Rabbis called it Chagiga, the holiday. And of course it shows up here in John. Now after these things Jesus walked in the Galilee, for he would not walk in Jewry, because the Jews sought to kill him. Remember, John is not eyewitness testimony. It's later. It's being written to a non-Jewish audience. It doesn't seem to need to be as historically accurate as the synoptic Gospels as far as believability of the Jewish background. Now the Jews' Feast of Tabernacles was at hand, and his brothers therefore said, "Depart hence and go to Judea, that your disciples may see the works that you do. For there is no man that does anything in secret, and he himself seeks to be known openly. But if you do these things, show yourself to the world." For neither did his brothers believe in him. Then Jesus said, "My time is not yet come, but your time is always ready. The world cannot hate you, but me it hates, because I testify of it, and the works thereof are evil. Go up to the feast." Notice the language, go up to the feast. Aliyah beregel, which is the rabbinic language of going up for the sacrifice for the holidays. "I do not yet go up to this feast, for my time is not yet fully come." Again, he's breaking rabbinic law by saying, I have my own reason not to be doing this observance, which is mandatory upon me. So it's just like the Passover bread and the Passover wine. I won't do it yet. Right? You eat it now. You drink it now. You go to the holiday now. I won't do it yet. Right? That's a basic kind of tone going on here. His brothers were gone up, and then he also went, but not openly, but in secret. And the Jews sought him at the feast, saying, "Where is he?" There was much murmuring, and etc., etc. And he goes up to the temple, and he teaches, and the story goes from there. The feast in Jerusalem is also in the book of Acts. Okay. And then that final day, we don't need to go into. Okay, so the background of the holidays are the pilgrimage holidays. Okay? So that's known. All right, so let's kind of go summary time here. There's a holiness question here that we didn't give you text, we didn't really have time, that Jesus says very clearly that none shall come to the Father except through me, meaning himself. His teachings place himself in the way of the observance of some of the most core rituals of Jewish life at that time. And he clearly he feels the authority or the impetus to put himself over the Torah, over rabbinic law, against the arguments of Hillel and Shammai, and even not concerned with his own personal observance of the major holidays, pilgrimage holidays of Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot. However, all these things are known to the Christian Bible. The Christian Bible teaches a background of Jews who faithfully make pilgrimage. Remember, his parents used to go every year for the Passover feast. Faithfully observe Sukkot, the ingathering of the harvest and the peoples in the fall. He tells his people to go. In later Acts of the Apostles and other places, there's a question, for example, about Timothy and whether or not a child should be circumcised. And the answer is yes, the child should be circumcised. And on top of that, all the Jesus stuff comes into play. So there's this kind of sense that normative Judaism is allowed to continue to be going as the backdrop for the Jesus ministry. Okay, so the Jesus ministry and life of teaching is happening within a backdrop where Judaism is not being stopped. He's not saying don't do these things. However, he does teach things that are in conflict with Torah and Torah law. And when his followers break Torah law because they're hungry, his answer is to turn to them. And so there's a series of teachings within the New Testament where the typical characteristic of Jesus is to go for the person in need, to go for the person on the outskirts of society, and to critique power and to critique mainstream leadership. So he's not so opposed to Rome, but he's really nasty about the Pharisees, the synagogues, and the temple. Right? So that whole thing he's railing against. Why? Because he's one of them. He's living within that world, right? You're not spending a lot of time talking about France or Canada. You're spending all your political energy talking about what's happening in America, right? And you, in the last 6 months, have probably had many, many political conversations, and some of them may have been quite energetic at times. Why? Because that's your place and those are your people. And when they do things that are ticking you off, you're going to talk about it, right? And if you go to Washington, you may go to Washington with a message. And you're going to talk about it. And if you do the wrong things while you're there, you might get arrested. And if the wrong things are really, really bad, you might face punishment. Right? And so that's kind of what's going on here. He's working from within the system. I think you have to read him as a guy who is at least culturally, religiously knowledgeable about general Judaism, common Judaism of the day, and observant within it and playing off it. He knows some texts, he knows some teachings. He functions as a Pharisee. He doesn't talk about temple sacrifices. He's not functioning as a Sadducee. He doesn't talk about withdrawal from the community or withdrawal from political relations in a way that he'd have to go to the desert. He's not an Essene. He's not trying to foment political revolution. He's not a zealot. So he's working within the Pharisaic system more than anything else, but he has no access to power, for sure. And he's not doing anything that would grant him access to power. So he's playing in that world, and he's tweaking it, and he's criticizing it, and he's amending it, sometimes flouting it, and he's not denying the larger claims about who he might be. And then on purpose, he goes to the city of Jerusalem at the most heightened moment. And then at that point, the texts all become a different thing. And I don't know about how much historicity we can really get out of how it talks about the trial, because it talks about the trial from a highly skewed point of view that really isn't how jurisprudence would have been operating in Jerusalem at that time, but fits the need of the narrative really well. So the trial of Jesus, I don't think, gives us insight into the Sanhedrin or the Pharisees on too much level, but there are little gleanings in there we can find, like the idea of 2 witnesses to convict a man, or is the court convicting him of death? And when they can't convict him, what do? And they send him back to Pilate, right? And all that kind of stuff. So the background is, for the most part, a credible Judaism, but a nasty and mean-spirited portrayal of religious leadership and religious institutions, which is understandable since those are the institutions that played some role in his rejection and ultimately in his continued incarceration leading to his execution under Rome. So the backlash against the power of religion at this time really takes off in the later books of Christianity outside the land of Israel, as we saw in Corinthians and Acts and others. That's where the Jews start to get talked about one way, and the Lord Jesus held up in another way, and the knowledge that he was always being sought after for death by them, and he went knowingly to his death to proclaim the kingdom of heaven. And that whole idea that he becomes the sacrifice of God for the forgiveness of sin is a non-Jewish turn entirely away from the Passover sacrifice that really fits the theology of the church itself and no longer matches any Jewish categories of religiosity from the day. The other thing that would have been an access to holiness at the time would have been mikveh and purity laws. No mention of them in any way in the Gospels. And the only thing you have is a couple of washing stories where he washes the disciples' hands and feet before the Last Supper, or where Pilate washes his hands before saying, I'm not guilty of this death. That's not exactly mikveh. But there's no claim that he's a Cohen or a Levi either. See, if he's not a Cohen, he's not a Levi, then he wouldn't have been engaged necessarily in the things where he has to do more of the purity stuff than maybe other people did. But there's a scholarly debate about how much mikveh was really being observed by people at the time.
But you have John the Baptist.
You have John the Baptist, but he's baptizing in the name of the kingdom of heaven. It's not clear that he's doing mikveh. Right? He's using mikveh, but he's using it for some other purpose. Right? And that was an important moment for Jesus, but Jesus doesn't then go on and do that to his followers. Like when his followers come to him, he doesn't say, okay, let's go down to the river and then you can be pure. So you don't have that. The purity of the holiness of the kingdom of heaven seems to come only through Jesus and his teachings. And of course for Judaism that would have been reprehensible. Right? We have our own access through the entire Torah system of temple that's up there. We know exactly how to be forgiven by God, how to be in touch with God, how to fulfill the covenant with God. This would have been seen as certainly bizarre. And off the beaten path.
Where did you get the name Christ?
Christ is Greek from Christos, which means anointed, from Meshuach. It means anointed with the oil, which is what would have been done for a king who is in his, coronation ceremony, but also in the high priest. So religious and secular leaders authorized by God would have been anointed with the oil that's used to smear on the temple altar and things like that, as far as being proclaimed and named to be the religious or secular leader of God on earth. So he's called that by later generations. He doesn't call himself the Christ. He doesn't call himself the Messiah. Are you the Messiah, the Son of God? Shh.
You said so.
In one thing it says, he bade them tell this unto no one. That's his answer when his disciples asked him the question. Right? And he bade them tell this unto no one. So, again, does he say, there's two ways to do that. If I'm like putting on a play, and that's the libretto. Peter's going to come over and say, hey, are you the Messiah, Son of God? And Jesus could either say, oh my God, don't ever say that again. Or he could say, shh, please don't tell people. Right? Two different ways to deliver the line, they would mean completely different things. And again, based on where you're lined up on the topic ahead of time is how you're going to read the line. Okay? So Judaism in the New Testament is fascinating. It's legitimate. I do think Jews should read the New Testament. I don't think there's anything in there that's going to make a Jew who knows their own tradition and is observant of the covenant fall away from that and abandon our people and our legacy and our future and their place in the world to come through their Torah learning. I don't think any of that is in danger, because most of what it does when a Jew reads it, the Jew goes, oh my God, he just broke Shabbos. Right? Wait a minute, it's the Torah that says you can get divorced. He's calling me an adulterer because half of you are divorced, right? That's according to the scientific studies. So people aren't going to read this and say, wow, that's what I've been looking for. So I think Jews should not be afraid of exploring the literature. Plus, you should understand your Christian neighbors. And then to the final point, which is where Benice tried to take us, and I wanted to leave us not there, is if you know the texts, you can answer the anti-Semite. And when the anti-Semite uses Christian garb to blame Jews and to say you can persecute and hate Jews because they're guilty of the killing of Christ, it's not a very common Christian or anti-Semite who does that, because that's not what the churches are teaching anymore. But you need to know that you've read the books and you say, oh, give me a break. Right? Give me a break. And you can engage in some form of dialogue enough to at least not stand there and say, well, gee, I don't know. Okay?
So what you're saying is Daf Yomi or the New Testament, right?
Do your Daf Yomi, and maybe on vacation read the New Testament. Right? Your Torah learning is what you really need to be doing normally. Okay? All right, it's been a lot of fun. Let's give a round of applause. That's 3 intense weeks. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.